Victorian Britain, a humorous journey through history 1837–1901. The era that made modern life slightly less terrible. Yes, the Victorians. Your clothes, fashionable denim or tragic athleisure. Your home, clutter and existential dread included, and your basic rights or lack thereof, were fundamentally transformed by the bustling, hypocritical melodrama that was Victorian Britain, 1837 to 1901. This wasn't just a dreary period marked by whalebone. This was the actual, smog-choked, and deeply judgmental birth of our modern world. This video condenses 64 years of upheaval, revealing how the vulgar wealth generated by the British Empire and the clanking horror of the Industrial Revolution created extreme social division. The rich lived in opulence that would make a hedge fund manager blush, while the poor endured conditions requiring an immediate tetanus shot. More importantly, this morally offensive inequality didn't just fester. It sparked the essential social reforms and revolutionary ideas that still shape our lives, from labor laws to the precise angle at which we judge our neighbors. The Victorian era, that majestic age of top hats and terrible sanitation, dawned dramatically on June 20, 1837. Petite Princess Alexandrina Victoria was rudely awakened at Kensington Palace with news that would alter history and increase demand for royal portrait painters. Her underwhelming uncle, King William IV, had finally died, accidentally making the astonished 18-year-old the sovereign ruler of the most powerful, perpetually damp nation on earth. Within a few stressful hours, Victoria, possibly still in her dressing gown, met the formidable Privy Council alone, deciding that waiting for adult supervision was beneath her newfound station. This bold move demonstrated a youthful, perhaps reckless, confidence that set the tone for a lengthy, transformative era. This slightly panicked transition occurred as Britain industrialized itself into intense noise and perpetual motion. The world's first industrial nation experienced growth so dramatic it seemed to violate the laws of civilized history by creating too many things too quickly. Steam engines, those marvelous, terrifying contraptions, roared day and night, relentlessly powering the grimy, profitable backbone of British economic might. Coal production, the black gold that kept the mechanism running and Londoners dusty, had soared from 10 million tons annually to over 30 million by Victoria's coronation. This fueled industry and a transportation revolution, as railways, those magnificent metal serpents, began crisscrossing the countryside, radically shrinking the island and terrifying the cows. Britain in 1837 was a nation of stark contrasts, like a magnificent silk coat draped over refuse. Industrialization created morally dubious wealth for a select few, producing devastating poverty for the vast majority, proving economic progress requires someone else to suffer immensely. The 1832 Reform Act, celebrated as a great leap forward, expanded voting rights to portions of the middle class. But this tweak left 95% of adults, including all women and working-class men, without meaningful representation. The aristocracy, who inherited wealth by simply being born correctly, maintained their stubborn grip on power through the House of Lords, even as new industrial capitalists, ruthless merchants of steel and cotton, accumulated fortunes that rivaled the ancient family estates. The vast empire Victoria inherited, sprawling like aggressive mold, expanded dramatically during her lengthy reign, driven by the unshakable belief that everyone, everywhere, needed to be governed by the British. Territories spanned Canada, the Caribbean, India, and the sheep-filled lands of Australia, plus strategic, fortified outposts across Africa, primarily to secure trade routes and look terribly important. The bizarre East India Company, a quasi-governmental corporation with its own private army, controlled India, treating the subcontinent less like a population and more like a valuable, though troublesome, resource mine. Meanwhile, Australian settler colonies rapidly expanded, displacing those who had the misfortune of living there first. This immense power brought unprecedented resources, exotic goods, like delightfully foreign spices and silks, and global influence, but also pesky moral responsibilities. These troubled Victorian consciences, usually manifesting as letters to the Times published by earnest clergymen who weren't actually in charge of running anything, religious revival movements, fueled by the fear of damnation and a desire to stop fun, reshaped society as Victoria took the throne. Evangelicalism, a vigorous Protestant strain, emphasized salvation, moral rectitude, and reform, influencing the complacent Church of England and nonconformists. This fervor drove campaigns against moral failings, temperance, prostitution, while inspiring humanitarian efforts addressing poverty, illiteracy, and labor exploitation. Slightly terrifying Sunday schools became central, teaching doctrine, solemnity, and basic literacy to working-class children. Technology transformed daily life at a bewildering pace, leaving traditionalists gasping. Gaslighting, that marvelous, hiss-filled invention smelling faintly of rotten eggs, illuminated streets, chasing away darkness. Nightlife boomed, alarming moral guardians who preferred everyone tucked in by 9 p.m. The telegraph revolutionized communication, allowing messages to travel faster than a speeding horse. Businessmen made fortunes and governments declared wars instantly. Printing advances produced cheaper media for a growing, literate, and much more opinionated population. Photography, that miraculous mechanism for capturing light and making everyone look slightly ill, soon altered visual culture, ensuring future generations knew exactly how severe everyone looked in the 1850s. London, that glorious, chaotic, and aggressively expanding megalopolis, was unlike anything previously seen in human history. By 1837, its population exceeded 1.5 million souls, crammed together in a stunning display of density. It was undeniably the largest, most influential, and arguably the filthiest urban center in the known world. Its docks, a hive of ceaseless activity and questionable odors, acted as the empire's greedy digestive system. Factories produced everything from ornate furniture to efficient firearms, while powerful financial institutions bankrolled global development. This dizzying expansion brought unprecedented challenges. Overcrowding, pollution, disease, often cholera, a terrifying killer, and poverty demanded new, systemic approaches to urban governance and sanitation, just to keep people alive long enough to work another day. The Victorian period began with a spirit of confidence that bordered dangerously on hubris. Britain, in its self-congratulatory mind, saw itself as the actual workshop of the world, a shining, soot-covered beacon destined to spread enlightenment, along with a healthy dose of commercial exploitation, through superior technology and imperial governance. This self-assured nationalism fueled remarkable achievements and profound ethical failures. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships aggressively connected continents, while scientific discoveries, from evolution to electricity, fundamentally altered man's place in the universe. Behind this magnificent, slightly dusty facade lay a complex society carved into rigidly defined strata. A discerning Victorian could identify someone's precise social standing, perhaps even their credit rating, from a single expertly delivered glance at their boots. 109 words. The class system was a torturous masterpiece of social engineering, creating non-intersecting universes governed by rules so arbitrary that etiquette manuals emerged just to teach the newly wealthy how not to embarrass themselves by using the wrong spoon for the fish course. Victorian Britain was divided into three classes. At the pinnacle stood the aristocracy and landed gentry, whose primary accomplishment was securing and holding land centuries ago. Comprising barely 2% of the population, these few controlled nearly 75% of the land, an imbalance perfectly acceptable to them. Living off rental income and investments, they rarely engaged in the distasteful, vulgar world of honest labor. Their children received classical educations at Eton or Harrow, learning Latin and how to disdain the mercantile classes. Oxford or Cambridge served not for career preparation, but exclusively for forming vital social connections to ensure continued dominance. The slightly neurotic middle class represented a revolutionary, if fussy, force, embodying the new power of money and respectability. Comprised of doctors, wealthy lawyers, clergymen, and factory owners, this segment embodied the virtues of industry, aggressive thrift, and unwavering respectability, often to an exhausting degree. Their homes became showcases of propriety and success, filled with ornate furniture, necessary pianos, even if unplayed, and objects demonstrating wealth and impeccable taste or adherence to trends. Families obsessively maintained appearances, knowing upward trajectory depended on visible adherence to strict, suffocating behavioral codes. They lived in new suburban developments, neat, orderly, semi-detached perfection, designed to separate them from the intimidating aristocratic squares and the terrifying working-class neighborhoods. For the vast working class, nearly 80% of the population, doing most of the actual heavy lifting, Victorian Britain offered a dramatically harsher reality. Industrial laborers, miners, and dock workers endured grueling 12 to 16-hour workdays in dangerous, often lethal conditions, exposed to toxic fumes, crushing machinery, and unforgiving foremen. Their homes, often notorious urban rookeries, consisted of a single, suffocating room housing entire families, sharing outdoor toilets and contaminated water. Disease spread rapidly through these unsanitary quarters, contributing to shorter lifespans and high infant mortality. Children rarely attended school past age 10, dispatched into factories or service to support struggling families. Their rough clothing and physical appearance, marked by hard labor and poor nutrition, indelibly marked them as different from their social betters. Class boundaries were policed by countless visible and invisible markers, creating a societal minefield. Clothing was the immediate class identifier. A gentleman's tailored suit and polished top hat contrasted hilariously with a laborer's rough, patched cotton built for utility. Accents and vocabulary acted as a permanent audio tag. Pronunciation differences were so distinct that classes struggled to understand each other, despite speaking the same English. Posture and walking manners were class-specific, trained early to ensure one never confused a swaggering aristocrat with a hurried shop clerk. Despite rigid stratification, the Victorian era, driven by industrial capitalism, saw unprecedented, though strictly limited, social mobility. Ruthless industrialists rose from humble origins to acquire enormous wealth, proving that if you were clever and slightly unscrupulous, you could make it big. Meanwhile, the expanding civil service and colonial administration created bureaucratic pathways for middle-class advancement, offering careers that required intellect rather than inherited land. The nouveau riche, however, having made money too quickly, often discovered with bitterness that wealth alone couldn't buy immediate acceptance into established society, regardless of their carriages. This social dilemma fueled a massive demand for etiquette manuals and finishing schools, which taught everything from which fork to use for the fish course to how to properly introduce people of different ranks. As one popular guide, designed to mock social climbers, warned with dry precision, "It is better to be quietly correct than ostentatiously elegant," implying that subtlety was far more expensive than gold. The wealthy displayed status not just through possessions, but through charity, proving both their robust fortune and the purity of their moral virtue. Philanthropy became a mandatory duty, though it came with strict, paternalistic conditions. Recipients had to attend mandatory religious services, sign uncompromising temperance pledges, or demonstrate their deserving status through proper deference, unquestioning obedience, and often theatrical gratitude. The Victorian middle-class home was a heavily draped moral fortress, designed to keep the chaos of the outside world firmly outside. The nuclear family was elevated to a religious institution, a private sanctuary where domesticity was the unquestionable creed. The saying, "A man's home is his castle," represented the belief that this space provided spiritual protection from the corrupting, germ-infested influences of industrial society. Families invested heavily in homes reflecting this sanctity, featuring separate rooms for specific, morally appropriate functions. Parlors for respectable guests, drawing rooms for women, studies for men, and nurseries safely sequestered upstairs, far from adult vices. Victorian architecture was meticulously designed to reinforce moral purpose and social hierarchy. Imposing front doors separated the morally dubious street from the sound domestic space. Heavy drapes shielded windows from prying eyes. Corridors ensured necessary, but socially invisible servants moved without being seen. Even plumbing, that necessary evil, reflected moral values. Indoor bathrooms, undeniable acknowledgments of bodily function, were carefully hidden and referred to only obliquely. Marriage, the supposed domestic sanctuary, was intensely regulated by rigid legal frameworks that heavily favored men. A respectable wife was expected to manage the household, supervise servants, and embody Patmore's angel in the house. Pure and morally superior, yet completely subservient to her husband. When marriage failed, women faced devastating consequences. Before the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act, divorce required an expensive act of parliament, a legal luxury accessible only to the wealthy. Even after this modest reform, the rules remained hilariously unequal. Men could divorce their wives simply for adultery, while women had to prove additional, grievous offenses like cruelty or desertion for the same meager relief. The Victorian obsession with propriety extended to domestic life. Language became so prudish one could hardly mention human anatomy. Table legs became limbs, and chickens had only white meat and dark meat, avoiding suggestive breasts or thighs. Impending parenthood used euphemisms like "in an interesting condition" or "respectable internal swelling." This modesty reflected anxieties about sexuality, which paradoxically coexisted with thriving pornography and widespread prostitution. The 1834 Obscene Publications Act targeted explicit materials and any information about contraception, fearing such knowledge would undermine the family unit and lead to moral anarchy. For the middle class, that judgmental engine of consumerism, displaying the right possessions was essential to maintaining respectability. Homes required non-negotiable objects. A mandatory parlor piano, even if unplayed, prominent leather-bound religious texts, and quality furniture. These items proved moral character and good taste. Families maintained facades while struggling with debt, prioritizing the appearance of wealth over solvency. A respectable home also required a live-in servant. Families often sacrificed food or heating to maintain this crucial status marker. Victorian society's inherent, staggering contradictions appeared nowhere more starkly or more ironically than in its systemic treatment of women. The very same pious culture that claimed to revere women as morally superior, almost ethereal beings, simultaneously denied them basic legal rights, refused them access to meaningful education, and stripped them of all autonomy, all while being ironically headed by a powerful, reigning queen who personally condemned women's rights activists as mad, wicked folly. This profound, structural paradox shaped the daily, confined lives of every single Victorian woman, from the desperate factory worker to the most privileged aristocrat. The legal status of married women was a genuine legal absurdity. Under the doctrine of coverture, a wife's entire legal existence was considered elegantly draped, like a damp veil, over her husband's person, rendering her a non-entity. Upon marriage, she surrendered property, wages, inheritance, and legal personhood, becoming a mere extension of her spouse. If abandoned, she had no legal recourse to recover children or demand support. Husbands could confine wives to asylums for being merely troublesome or inconvenient. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime, reflecting the belief that a wife had no right to refuse her husband. While the law treated all women as subordinate, daily life varied brutally by class. Wealthy women managed enormous households and staff, engaging in charity work, but were still barred from higher education or professional careers. 123 words, ritualized social calls, formalized invasions of privacy tracking social standing, charity work, more for reputation than altruism, and meticulous entertainments required the constant, suffocating presence of a hawk-eyed chaperone. This surveillance only ceased when marriage transferred the burden of ownership to a husband. Physical constraints were equally rigid, demanding women participate in their own slow strangulation. Aggressively fashionable corsets reduced the acceptable waist to 16 inches, a circumference more suited to a drainpipe, resulting in the delightful side effects of internal organ damage and breathing difficulties. True feminine elegance, it seemed, required a sustained commitment to oxygen deprivation. For working-class women, governed by the undainty realities of subsistence, fragile Victorian ideals were impractical luxuries, requiring too much time and clean fabric while hauling coal. These women toiled in factories, worked as domestic servants, took in laundry, or sold goods on streets, performing relentless economic contribution while bearing and raising numerous children, often navigating simultaneous gestation and grueling physical labor. A cotton mill worker might labor 14 hours a day even while pregnant, returning to work days after giving birth, presumably having tucked the newborn beneath the spinning jenny. Meanwhile, 1 in 3 working-class women in London worked in domestic service. Trapped between the basement and the attic, they faced isolation, high risk of sexual harassment, and constant scrutiny of their moral character, as if existing below stairs made one inherently suspicious. Victorian female education remained strictly limited, ensuring the delicate female brain was not overtaxed by actual knowledge. Girls received vocational training for the marriage market, accomplishments designed to attract husbands. The 4 sacred arts of domestic display included repetitive piano, mediocre watercolor painting, breathy singing, and meticulous needlework, proving them decorative and docile. Crucially, intellectual pursuits were actively discouraged as damaging to reproductive health, a convenient excuse. Doctors warned challenging mental work caused infertility or hysteria, confirming geometry textbooks were medically equivalent to self-sterilization. When Bedford College opened in 1849 as the first higher education institution for women, daring to suggest functional cerebral cortexes, it faced ridicule. The consensus, a dangerous experiment destined to produce unfecund, overly opinionated spinsters. But, because human beings are frustratingly resistant to being told they must remain delicate ornaments, a defiant women's rights movement gradually emerged. In 1855, Caroline Norton, ruined by coverture and denied access to her children, successfully campaigned for the Infant Custody Act. This legislative triumph, in a staggering display of paternal generosity, allowed mothers limited access to children under 7. Meanwhile, Barbara Bodishin led the campaign for married women's property rights, a radical demand suggesting a woman's salary shouldn't instantly become her husband's pocket money. Josephine Butler fought the Contagious Diseases Acts, a magnificent hypocrisy allowing police to arrest suspected prostitutes for mandatory, humiliating examinations while leaving male clients untouched, who were assumed immune from fault or disease. Thankfully, the literary world provided an arena for challenging gender roles, allowing subversive ideas to sneak past censors disguised as enjoyable reading. Brave female authors like Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot, Marion Evans, who wisely adopted a masculine moniker, created heroines who defied conventional expectations, insisting women were more than just pretty furniture. The ultimate irony was that these writers often published under male pseudonyms, a necessary disguise in a world terrified of female intelligence, to ensure their work was taken seriously, because clearly any novel worth reading required a Y chromosome. Their novels questioned women's limited options, highlighting the miserable constraints of the marriage market, and portrayed female characters with intellectual depth and moral complexity. Women were routinely paid up to 60% less than men for similar work, an impressive demonstration of economic inequality. This financial sleight of hand was justified by the belief that women worked only for pin money, funding frivolous purchases, not supporting families. This was a cruel fiction for countless widows and single women staring down destitution, desperately wishing pin money could transform into rent and bread money. Amidst the misery and exploitation, the most controversial aspect of industrial employment was not the 60-hour week or lack of safety railings, but the charming phenomenon known as child labor. While children had always worked in agricultural settings, perhaps chasing chickens, factory labor was different, substituting wholesome outdoor toil for grease, smoke, noise, and the constant threat of having an appendage devoured by satanic mechanisms of iron and steam. The factory environment was regimented, ensuring maximum productivity, dangerous with daily near misses involving limb-removing gears, and supervised by intimidating strangers whose management technique involved shouting and physical force. Imagine the efficiency. Children as young as 5, barely taller than a boot, were pressed into service as piecers in textile mills. This job required them to be tiny, nimble, and utterly expendable, crawling beneath running machinery to tie broken threads, perfectly utilizing their small stature and the factory owner's desire to keep the wheels of capital turning. For those seeking a chemical career path, the match industry beckoned. In match factories, children dipped sticks into phosphorus compounds, a substance that conveniently glowed beautifully in the dark, which caused the charming ailment known as phossy jaw. This horrific condition involved jawbones literally decaying while victims remained alive, ensuring the worker had plenty of time to contemplate the irony of losing their face to the very product they helped create, all for the noble cause of lighting Victorian parlors. Industrial geography reflected a stark philosophy of efficiency. Human habitat was subservient to profit. Factory towns were transformed environments. Chaotic villages were replaced by brutal, rationalist geometry. Streets were arranged in rigid grids for efficiency and surveillance, featuring the uniformity of identical workers, housing constructed by factory owners, ensuring no employee mistook themselves for an individual. Happily, some captains of industry garnished exploitation with paternalism, giving rise to company towns like Saltaire, built by Titus Salt. If you owned your employees' lives, provide a slightly nicer cage. The Quaker sensibility softened capitalism's edges. Bournville, created by the Cadbury family, represented more enlightened approaches, providing better housing, schools, and recreation. This benevolent control was still under the watchful eye of the factory owner, ensuring investment in healthy workers wasn't wasted on independent thought or union organization. The begrudging recognition that 5-year-olds shouldn't crawl under moving machinery spurred Parliament into action, resulting in the early factory acts addressing the worst abuses. This legislative response, moving at the pace of a sedated sloth, began with the 1833 Act. It prohibited factory work for children under 9, a stunning concession, as 9-year-olds were mill veterans, and limited those under 13 to 8-hour shifts a generous holiday compared to the previous 14-hour marathon. Later legislation restricted hours improved safety requirements, usually only after sufficient mangled limbs were registered, and mandated basic education for child workers, so they could read the terrifying safety warnings they ignored. However, these reforms faced fierce resistance from industrial interests, who argued that restricting the ability of toddlers to work 12 hours a day was a direct assault on free market capitalism. To make matters worse, factory inspectors were too few to enforce regulations effectively, and owners ignored the law, as penalties were laughably small. They used warning bells to alert managers when inspectors approached, allowing time to hide the youngest children in barrels, turning the factory into a grim game of hide-and-seek. By the 1880s, new unionism began organizing previously ignored unskilled factory workers, proving that even the lowest paid could find strength in numbers, a concept utterly horrifying to management. This vigor was highlighted by the infamous 1888 match girl strike at Bryant and May's London factory, focusing public attention on young women exposed to toxic phosphorus. The ensuing outcry finally pushed factories to adopt safer red phosphorus processes, proving that sometimes, even in cynical Victorian manufacturing, public shaming achieved what years of government inaction could not. The factories stood as colossal, smoky contradictions, symbolizing industrial triumph and human cost. They were monuments to progress, harnessing steam power, yet sites of exploitation, treating humans as disposable cogs in the magnificent machine. They produced the consumer goods defining material culture, demanding tremendous sacrifice measured in lung capacity, digits, and life expectancy. This profound contradiction at the heart of Victorian prosperity was a moral gap the ruling classes stepped over with remarkable dexterity, usually while wearing very expensive machine-made boots. The profound contradictions of Victorian prosperity didn't go unchallenged. Eventually, the downtrodden realized they are the foundation upon which the entire opulent structure rests. The question hanging in the polluted air was, what happens when millions who build an empire's wealth demand a say in how it's governed? The answer arrived in 1838. The Chartist movement emerged as an unprecedented phenomenon, marking the first time British working-class people organized massively to demand political rights. They realized demanding a better wage was pointless if the men who decided wages also made the laws. The movement coalesced around the People's Charter, drafted by William Lovett and other radicals who held the radical notion that citizenship should involve more than just working until you died, understanding that without political representation, workers would remain powerless. Their demands were revolutionary in simplicity, yet terrifyingly radical to the landed gentry controlling Parliament. Universal male suffrage, equal electoral districts, ending rotten boroughs, removal of property, qualifications for MPs, payment for MPs, since only the rich work for free, annual elections to keep politicians uncomfortable, and the secret ballot so tenants could vote against landlords without fear. The core question: why should those who produce Britain's wealth have no voice in its governance? Chartism's magnificent voice belonged to Fergus O'Connor, a charismatic Irish lawyer turned radical whose theatrical flair made him the movement's recognizable leader. His newspaper, the Northern Star, reached an extraordinary 50,000 copies weekly, creating a national network of engaged workers. The paper served as an organizing and educational platform, moving workers past simple wage disputes toward the grander goal of democracy. Chartism's ability to mobilize astonished the establishment. Chartism's first national petition in 1839 gathered an astonishing 1.28 million signatures, a staggering logistical feat in the age before email and photocopiers, at a time when Britain's entire population was about 18 million. Predictably, when Parliament contemptuously rejected it without debate, essentially treating the collective will of over 1 million citizens as scrap paper, the movement split between moral force Chartists who advocated continual peaceful pressure, the sensible, patient ones, and physical force Chartists who believed more dramatic action might be necessary, the ones who'd had quite enough of being polite. The Newport Rising, November 1839, was a spectacular failure of revolutionary zeal. Thousands of Welsh miners, led by John Frost, marched on Newport armed mostly with good intentions and mining tools. Troops opened fire, killing at least 22 protesters. The government swiftly suppressed the insurrection. The official response was medievally dramatic. Frost and leaders were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This archaic punishment, marking the last time it was pronounced in Britain, caused widespread revulsion. The sentences were later commuted to transportation to Australia, a much more civilized form of permanent exile. 85 words. Undeterred, the movement regrouped. The second national petition in 1842 gathered over 3.3 million signatures, a mind-boggling display of unity, but was again rejected by Parliament, which consistently ignored the wishes of millions. Economic distress that year fueled the plug plot riots. In a literal act of sabotage, workers removed plugs from factory boilers, shutting down production. Authorities responded with military force, property damage being more concerning than starvation, leading to bloody confrontations. The final Chartist petition arrived during the revolutionary fervor of 1848, when toppled European monarchies made the British establishment nervous. Terrified of similar uprisings, the government stationed 85,000 special constables throughout London, including volunteers like Louis Napoleon and William Gladstone. The gathering remained peaceful, denying the government the confrontation it desired. The petition claimed 5 million signatures, but cynical parliamentary counters revealed numerous fraudulent names, such as Victoria Rex, the Duke of Wellington, and Pugnose the dog. Counted at far fewer, the petition was again rejected. Chartism gradually declined after defeat, but its legacy extended far beyond its formal existence, like a revolutionary ghost haunting the halls of power. The ultimate irony? 5 of the 6 demands were eventually adopted into British law, proving the Chartists were merely decades ahead of their time. These included the secret ballot, 1872, payment for MPs, 1911, ensuring Parliament was no longer the playground of the wealthy, equal electoral districts, abolition of property qualifications, 1858, and near universal male suffrage, 1918. Only annual parliaments remain unimplemented, a minor concession to the political class who prefer longer careers. 95 words. Chartism transformed ordinary workers into political actors, proving those smelling faintly of coal dust and factory grease could grasp complex theory. Women like Knight and Marion Walker formed female associations, challenging male suffrage focus while advocating for women's rights. Chartist associations established reading rooms and political education, creating leaders who formed trade unions, cooperatives, and mutual aid societies, the organizational backbone for future British labor politics. Working class demands fueled social reforms. The middle and upper classes suddenly pressed, fixed things themselves, often mixing genuine concern with pure self-preservation. Lord Shaftesbury leveraged his aristocracy to champion factory laws. Florence Nightingale revolutionized nursing, proving a well-organized woman could terrify medical establishments into cleanliness and competence. Edwin Chadwick's bureaucratic obsession accidentally led to sanitation improvements that saved countless lives. Crucially, these reformers were responding to pressure from below, realizing reform was a small price to pay for avoiding revolution, thus responding to workers who refused to accept exploitation as a condition previously assumed to be immutable as physics. In 1845, a microscopic pathogen, the potato blight, Phytophthora infestans*, arrived in Ireland, demonstrating the devastating irony of monoculture. Spreading with terrifying speed, it turned healthy potato crops into rotting, blackened sludge almost overnight. For the average Irish tenant farmer, this was a death sentence, not merely an agricultural setback. The potato was the caloric engine of the nation, providing survival on tiny plots where no other crop yielded enough for an impoverished population. The British response revealed the darker side of Victorian economic philosophy, a spectacular failure of compassion rooted in rigid ideological adherence. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official overseeing relief, infamously declared the famine the judgment of God, suggesting the Almighty was teaching the Irish a lesson in moral improvement. This stunning theological arrogance perfectly excused governmental inaction. Such sentiments were mainstream, reflecting prevailing British belief in laissez-faire economics, that a starving market must not be interfered with, and moral culpability, holding victims responsible for their own destitution. The relief offered was calculated humiliation. Workhouses required the surrender of all property and separated families upon entry, forcing proud farmers to choose between starvation or psychological torture. The most damning evidence of ideological cruelty was the continuous export of food from Ireland throughout the crisis. While people collapsed from hunger along roadsides, ships laden with Irish wheat, oats, and livestock departed regularly for English markets. In 1847, the worst year, Black 47, nearly 4,000 vessels carried food exports to Britain. Armed guards often escorted these shipments past the starving, adding military cruelty to the profound injury. This reality fueled the bitter Irish, saying, "God sent the blight, but the English made the famine." A devastating summary: desperation drove unfathomable acts, pushing survival past human dignity. Parents fed children grass boiled with butter. Corpses were found with mouths stained green from nettles, and some drank cattle blood in a final, primitive struggle. Disease soon followed hunger, as weakened bodies welcomed typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, and scurvy. The dead often remained unburied, survivors being too weak to dig graves, leaving the landscape littered with tragic evidence. Those who could flee abandoned their homeland, seeking a place where the potato wasn't the only thing separating them from death. The coffin ships earned their name honestly as floating death traps. Mortality rates sometimes reached 30%. The Lucto, 1847, saw 117 of 462 passengers die. The Agnes lost 50%. Surviving the Atlantic was far from guaranteed. Survivors faced discrimination, clustering in slums like Boston's North End, exchanging rural destitution for urban squalor. The famine accelerated the decline of the Irish language, ripping the linguistic heart out of the nation as those fleeing were disproportionately Gaelic speakers. Traditional culture suffered, as survival replaced celebration. Ironically, the Catholic Church, retaining trust through relief efforts and shared suffering, emerged with strengthened, often conservative, influence that shaped Irish society for generations. The political consequences were profound. Young Ireland's failed 1848 rebellion, though crushed, planted nationalist seeds that grew into the Fenian Brotherhood, culminating in the 1916 Easter Rising. Ideas nourished by injustice outlived their planters. The famine shattered Irish faith in British governance, transforming loyalty into enduring bitterness. An 1847 Nation poem captured this indictment. "We are wretches, famished, scorned, human tools to build your pride, but God will yet take vengeance for the souls for whom Christ died." American Quakers sent substantial aid, but official British relief was constrained by laissez-faire ideology. When Sultan Abdul Majid offered a generous £10,000, British diplomats intervened to avoid embarrassing Queen Victoria, lest she look financially incompetent. The Sultan secretly sent 3 food ships to Drogheda, demonstrating superior decency, a gesture commemorated by the town adopting the Turkish star and crescent in its football club's emblem. Meanwhile, back in the heart of the empire, Britain was being decimated by a silent killer, proving the Industrial Revolution was an equal opportunity destroyer of health. Rapid industrialization created wealth but also perfect conditions for disease. In crowded cities, life expectancy plummeted. While rural residents lived to their 60s, industrial workers often perished before 40, cut short by consumption and pollution. The tragedy was striking because it was so preventable, requiring only basic infrastructure and the understanding that human waste shouldn't be consumed. Victorian cities were giant petri dishes, designed to spread every ailment. Raw sewage flowed directly into the Thames, creating a magnificent, fetid soup. Drinking supplies were drawn from these same waters, ensuring a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of contamination. Open cesspools festered between buildings, and thousands of families shared a single outdoor privy, a perfect hub for bacterial exchange. In 1858, the overwhelming stench, the Great Stink, forced Parliament to suspend sessions. This was poetic justice, the government paralyzed by its own filth. Members hung lime-soaked cloths over the windows, fighting sewage gas with scented fabric. Victorian doctors believed the miasma theory. Disease spread through foul air, blissfully unaware of germs. Blaming bad smells for cholera, this incorrect science led to a fortuitous outcome. Officials tackled sanitation. Joseph Bazalgette designed London's first comprehensive sewer system, an 1,100-mile network that redirected waste away from the Thames, finally separating drinking water from digestive output. Ignoring official ignorance, Dr. John Snow challenged the miasma theory with scientific rigor. In 1854, he meticulously mapped cholera deaths in London's Soho, tracing the outbreak to a single Broad Street water pump. By simply removing the handle, he halted the epidemic, proving contaminated water, not air, transmitted cholera. Though dismissed by authorities who preferred their elegant theories of vapors and humors, his work fundamentally changed public health. This meticulous grooming did little to prevent the inevitable tidal wave of disease lurking just around the next unemptied cesspit. The monumental Public Health Act of 1848 created the first National Health Board, a shining beacon of bureaucracy designed to save the masses from their own filth. Its powers, however, were hilariously limited by the Victorian reluctance to interfere with sacred private property rights. You could die from cholera caused by your neighbor's overflowing privy, but heaven forbid a government official suggest he clean it up. That, my dear fellow, would be communism and a gross violation of individual liberty. Not until 1875, after 3 decades of sufficient death convinced the wealthy that disease didn't discriminate, did a comprehensive act squeak through Parliament. It finally required local authorities, with an exasperated sigh, to provide the utterly revolutionary concepts of clean water, meaning water not visibly brown or chunky, proper drainage, a shocking innovation, as everything previously flowed wherever gravity dictated, and the delightfully modern service of regular waste removal. Naturally, these long overdue reforms came tragically too late for the countless victims of the 4 major cholera epidemics that struck Britain between 1831 and 1866. This proved that governmental efficiency, much like the sewage of the time, often moves at a pace best described as sluggish and dangerously contaminated. Victorian hospitals were, ironically, outright death traps, possessing a higher mortality rate than a duel with a disgruntled highwayman and offering few comforts besides the certainty of cross-infection. Florence Nightingale, the formidable lady with the lamp and formidable accounting skills, famously documented that soldiers in military hospitals, meant to patch them up for the glorious carnage, were more likely to succumb to preventable infections, like hospital gangrene, than to die from battle wounds. This suggested the most dangerous enemy was the surgeon's unwashed apron. In civilian institutions, patients often shared beds, a cozy arrangement for maximizing infection. Surgical instruments went merrily unwashed between operations, and esteemed doctors, operating in magnificent ignorance of germ theory, moved seamlessly from dissecting putrefying corpses to examining living patients upstairs, all without the inconvenience of washing their hands. Their main concern was simply getting the patient to stop screaming. Joseph Lister's scorned introduction of antiseptics in the 1860s was a revolutionary breakthrough, finally offering humanity a chance to stop dying from the very act of being treated. Lister sprayed the operating theater and wounds with a pungent mist of carbolic acid, a substance previously known for preserving railway ties. This dramatically reduced post-operative infections, turning amputation from a near-death sentence into a survivable inconvenience. When he published his irrefutable 1867 results, showing mortality plummeting from a terrifying 45%, nearly half your patients died, which was apparently acceptable, down to 15%, he expected acclaim. Instead, proving that intellectual stubbornness trumps evidence, many esteemed colleagues, the men whose patients were dying because they insisted on wearing their favorite blood-stained operating coats, vehemently ridiculed his methods. They argued the foul smell of carbolic acid was far more offensive than the occasional death of a patient. Consequently, It took several lethal decades for the brilliant simplicity of sterile procedures, a concept that boils down to "don't put dirt in the wound, you idiot," to grudgingly become standard practice, suggesting doctors are often the last people who want to hear new medical advice, especially if it involves soap. Solvent citizens avoiding the surgical death traps known as hospitals relied on a thriving, unregulated, and wildly profitable market of patent medicines. These dubious alternatives were guaranteed by the seller to cure everything from gout to a bad mood, perhaps even promising the ability to converse with squirrels. Sprawling advertisements in newspapers and magazines promised health, vigor, eternal youth, and maybe a winning lottery ticket, all for a few shillings and the risk of heavy metal poisoning. Products ranged from the infamous Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained enough morphine to keep teething babies delightfully quiet and dangerously addicted to opiates, to Berto's Bloods for female complaints, a vague category encompassing everything from menstrual cramps to the existential dread of being a Victorian woman. Safety standards were ignored as an impediment to entrepreneurial spirit. These unregulated concoctions contained a delightful list of dangerous ingredients straight out of a villain's chemistry set. Heavy metals like lead, mercury, for brain damage, arsenic, the universal Victorian poison of choice, and potent narcotics like opium and cocaine, guaranteed to make you feel better, right up until you died. The popular Daffy's elixir, marketed for everything from infantile colic to adult melancholy, was primarily cheap, industrial-strength gin with powerful laxatives. If it didn't cure your ailment, it guaranteed you'd stop complaining long enough to find a lavatory, shifting your focus entirely. Ignored by the male medical establishment, women were ruthlessly targeted by pseudo-medical entrepreneurs who knew selling hope in a pink bottle was easier than promoting actual medical research. Marketing genius Lydia Pinkham sold her vegetable compound promising comprehensive relief from all those painful complaints and weaknesses so common to our best female population. This wonderfully vague description ensured every woman felt included in the misery. While containing token herbs, the compound's powerful 18% alcohol content, roughly the strength of stiff sherry, provided temporary, blissful, and slightly slurred relief. Its actual medical benefits were negligible, unless you count becoming pleasantly drunk, which many Victorians clearly did. Similarly, Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people, implying anyone not robustly tanned was suffering a fatal deficiency, audaciously claimed to cure everything from complete paralysis to the ubiquitous diagnosis of female weakness. These miraculous pink pellets contained nothing more therapeutically active than plain old iron oxide, rust, and large amounts of sugar, proving that packaging and confidence are sometimes the best medicine, provided the patient is easily fooled. Beyond the dangerous, profitable, and often fatal realms of Victorian snake oil and fraudulent patent medicines, sold by men who deserved entrepreneurial purgatory for using arsenic, lay another battlefield, the systemic struggle for knowledge itself. The fight was to get a book into the hands of the common man before he returned to the factory floor. While the enviably wealthy, who could afford to ignore cholera and quack doctors, sent sons to be molded into future rulers at prestigious institutions like Eton and Harrow, learning Greek and the proper way to haste subordinates, the majority of Britain's children faced a stark reality defined by factory bells and empty stomachs. To put this educational desert into perspective. In 1840, while Britain was conquering half the world, less than 40% of its own children had meaningful access to formal education. This suggests the nation prioritized global domination over teaching youth to read patent medicine warning labels. For struggling working-class families, whose lives were measured in grueling shifts, schooling remained an unattainable luxury. Every family member's labor, no matter how small or young, was desperately needed simply to generate enough pennies to survive the week. The educational landscape was less a coherent system and more a confusing, disorganized mess, about as reliable as a three-legged mule trying to run a marathon. Luckier poor children attended dame schools, informally run by elderly women in their small, smoky homes. These unsanctioned classes attempted to teach rudimentary reading and a prayer or two for the paltry fee of a few pennies per week. Others found places in ragged schools, charitable institutions established by philanthropists to provide a basic education, more like crowd control, really, to the most destitute children of the urban slums. Operating in bleak, repurposed spaces like drafty warehouses or damp church basements, these schools served children deemed too poor, dirty, or ill-behaved for less despairing settings. Unsurprisingly, quality varied dramatically, ranging from dedicated havens to little more than glorified babysitting services. One shocked inspector described a typical dame school with palpable horror. A small, stuffy room, invariably overheated and underventilated, hosting 20 to 30 children crowded together on benches, sharing germs and learning by rote from tattered books. They were supervised by an elderly woman whose qualification is often merely that she is too old for any other employment. This suggests Victorian retirement planning involved teaching the alphabet for pennies in a dark, dangerous fire hazard. Rural areas offered even more limited education. Agricultural work took immediate precedence over schooling, especially during harvest seasons, when a child's small hands were considered far more valuable than a mind capable of learning. The journey from desperate liquid sustenance to a formalized ritual was completed when the Duchess of Bedford, Anna Maria Russell, invented afternoon tea in the 1840s. Conceived to stave off the existential void between the noon luncheon and the scandalously late 8 p.m. dinner, this essential custom filled the agonizing gap with miniature sustenance. Delicate sandwiches, fluffy scones, consumed with the appropriate, friendship-shattering debate over jam first or cream first, and precise cakes. All were presented on the finest, most intimidatingly fragile china. Even for families of modest means, maintaining a respectable, gleaming tea service was absolutely essential for preserving the barest veneer of respectability in a society defined by appearances. However, the true, unapologetic displays of status centered around exotic foods. The pineapple, that prickly, inconveniently shaped tropical fruit from South America, became the ultimate, shimmering luxury item in Britain, a symbol screaming, "I have disposable income and a severe lack of perspective." Cultivating these sun-loving fruits in the perpetually overcast British climate required outrageously expensive, meticulously heated glass houses, tropical prisons for fruit. Each thorny fruit cost the equivalent of thousands in today's money, a staggering price for a dessert that might occasionally cause one's tongue to itch. Unable to afford the permanent purchase of such a fleeting, perishable status symbol, many shrewd hosts resorted to the magnificent absurdity of renting pineapples purely for display at crucial dinner parties. The glowing orb sat prominently on the sideboard before its shamefaced return to specialized fruit rental entrepreneurs, or futurers, a gloriously real job title. These futurers, without cleaning or acknowledging the fruit's extensive social calendar, rented the exact same, slightly bruised fruit to another equally status-conscious host the very next evening, continuing its endless, silent tour of London's elite dining rooms. Beyond the starched tablecloths and passive-aggressive rituals of Victorian dining, where every gesture was judged, lay another world. This was where the deafening blare of factory whistles fell silent, granting the exhausted laborer precious, unprecedented hours of freedom. A hiatus previously unimaginable. The hilarious paradox was that the era fanatically glorifying grinding virtue would paradoxically birth the world's first mass entertainment industry and, crucially, the concept of free time, a slot designated for non-productive frivolity. The Industrial Revolution, transforming Britain from pastoral quaintness into a smog-choked dynamo, fundamentally revolutionized how people perceive time, forcing agrarian rhythms into a brutal, mechanical structure. Factory schedules, those metallic taskmasters, divided the day with pathological precision. Work and leisure became sharply delineated, creating something unknown to agricultural workers. Predictable free time to be why the 1870s, the successful Saturday half-holiday movement, a hard-won victory of aching backs, gained ground, gifting workers their first, glorious, if brief, taste of the weekend. A period dedicated entirely to ignoring the foreman. The expanding railway network dramatically transformed Victorian leisure, proving rapid transit could cure social malaise. These soot-belching excursion trains carried over 25 million passengers annually by the 1860s. Thousands of trapped factory workers, their lungs permanently stained black, could finally escape the disease-ridden cities for brief seaside retreats. Brighton, once the exclusive playground of the wealthy aristocracy, suddenly saw over 250,000 day-trippers on every bank holiday, turning the dignified shore into a roaring festival. Coastal towns responded commercially, building pleasure piers, perfect for overpriced whelks and promenades. Most famously, they built the comically restrictive bathing machines wheeled, wooden closets that allowed modest Victorians to enjoy the water while meticulously preserving propriety. This ensured no unseemly observation of the ankle could take place by either the sea or God. Meanwhile, music halls emerged as the quintessential working-class entertainment, a loud antidote to polite middle-class theater. Over 300 venues operated in London by 1870, guaranteeing a cheap pint and a dirty joke. For just a few pennies, audiences packed these smoke-filled palaces, enjoying riotous variety acts. Bellowing comedians, sentimental singers, acrobats, and baffling spectacles. Performers like the magnetic Marie Lloyd became national celebrities. Her songs, filled with cheeky double entendres, cleverly sidestepped nervous Victorian censorship by being technically about laundry or pies. The rowdy, beer-soaked atmosphere, with pervasive smoking and aggressive audience participation, booing was an art form. Horrified, earnest middle-class reformers who saw only moral decay. Yet, these venues provided vital cultural spaces where overworked people could briefly forget their troubles and the tyranny of the clock. Victorian sporting culture underwent an intense, bureaucratically driven transformation. Games that were previously violent, unregulated folk traditions, often involving 50 men attempting murder using a poorly inflated pig's bladder, were now codified with standardized rules, ensuring participants only suffered minor injuries. The Football Association was established in 1863, followed by the codification of rugby in 1871, a sport dedicated to proving human pain tolerance, and the comparatively genteel lawn tennis in 1877, requiring excellent court manners and pristine white attire. Even cricket, long and aristocratic pastime requiring days of leisure and lukewarm champagne, expanded into a ferocious national passion. County championships began in the 1870s, establishing regional rivalries that endure bitterly to this day. By the 1880s, professional football drew astonishing crowds of 30,000 spectators. Working men routinely sacrificed a week's worth of precious beer money just to stand in the mud and support their local, often semi-competent teams, a clear indication that leisure had become an economically viable, highly monetized industry. The Victorian home became its own self-contained entertainment center, a microcosm of middle-class anxiety and forced merriment. Parlor games, the evening's enforced entertainment, included whispery charades and the chaos of blind man's bluff. Most baffling was Snapdragon, a semi-pyrotechnic ritual requiring players to pluck raisins from actively burning brandy, a recipe for questionable life choices and minor burns. Musical performances, usually featuring a slightly talented daughter or self-important uncle at the piano, drove sheet music sales, mostly sentimental ballads, to dizzying levels, establishing the piano as the undisputed king of domestic furnishings. Finally, the stereoscope, a clunky, ornately carved device creating effective 3D images, became the Victorian equivalent of virtual reality, allowing families to tour exotic locations like the Alps or pyramids from the guaranteed safety of their sitting rooms. Public spectacles grew increasingly elaborate and exaggerated, catering to a public hungry for sensation. Panoramas, Massive curved paintings up to 400 feet long depicted grand history or romantic landscapes, drawing astonished, vertigo-stricken crowds. Magic lantern shows, the primitive precursor to cinema, projected hand-painted slides onto screens, creating ghostly apparitions of skeletons or moral allegories that delighted and terrified audiences equally. The modern circus, that enduring spectacle of organized chaos, was introduced by P.T. Barnum in the 1840s, bringing the three-ring spectacle, exotic animals, unhappy, human oddities, miserable, and flamboyant spectacle loud. Traditional holidays rapidly adapted to the era of consumerism. Christmas shifted dramatically from a minor, sober religious observance into the massive, consumer-driven centerpiece of Victorian family life. German-born Prince Albert introduced the decorated Christmas tree, complete with candles and flammable gifts. Dickens's A Christmas Carol cemented the holiday's association with necessary charity, guilt, and enforced family togetherness. The commercial engine fired up with Christmas cards, appearing in the 1840s. By the 1880s, over 11 million were sent annually, clogging mail routes and spreading manufactured cheer. While sentimental Victorian Christmas cards circulated by the millions, carrying wishes of peace and goodwill, the British Empire was simultaneously facing a brutal, muddy wake-up call that would shatter its romantic understanding of modern warfare. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, marked the collision between Britain's romanticized military glory, dashing heroism, and the grim, industrial realities of combat, mud, disease, incompetence. Though distant, this conflict reached violently into Victorian parlors in unprecedented ways. For the first time, citizens could follow battlefield developments almost instantly. William Howard Russell of the Times became the world's first true war correspondent, sending unflinching, horrifying accounts of military chaos and human suffering directly to London, where they were devoured with horrified fascination. His damning dispatches sparked national outrage, describing soldiers freezing in inadequate uniforms while crucial supplies rotted untouched on docks, a perfect symbol of institutional incompetence. The Telegraph, that miraculous machine, transmitted Russell's reports within hours, compressing the time between events and public awareness, making the war an immediate, agonizing reality. The conflict, a grand tragedy of errors, stemmed from Byzantine maneuvering over the declining Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. Russia sought control of strategic Black Sea routes, threatening British dominance. Britain, suffering imperial paranoia and fearing Russian expansion toward India, the indispensable jewel in the crown, allied with rivals France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia to check Russian ambitions. What followed was a catastrophic demonstration of British military unpreparedness, logistical failure, and organizational confusion. The miserable siege of Sevastopol dragged on for nearly a year, exposing gaping weaknesses in supply lines, command structures, and the rudimentary state of battlefield medicine. Winter, the ultimate indifferent enemy, brought unimaginable suffering. Thousands huddled in muddy, disease-ridden trenches with insufficient clothing, the wrong kind, naturally, and no proper shelter. One officer encapsulated the misery. "Our men have not a change of anything, no beds but the muddy ground, no covering but the sky." A summary of a disastrous campaign managed by men in warm London offices. The infamous charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava captured the war's tragic absurdity. A disastrous, vague communication, likely due to incompetence, sent 670 doomed British light cavalry charging directly into a valley flanked by devastating Russian artillery on three sides. A deadly ambush. Within minutes, over a third were killed or wounded. Lord Tennyson quickly immortalized their sacrifice and the command structure's profound stupidity in his poem. This heroic spin omitted the miscommunication, beginning with the iconic lines, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. While noble men died dramatically on the battlefield, a deadlier, insidious enemy stalked the camps. Preventable diseases. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus, invisible assassins, claimed far more soldiers than any Russian bullet. Military hospitals were glorified sheds, where the wounded were packed into filthy wards with minimal hygiene. The horrifying mortality rate reached an appalling 42%, prompting the historic intervention of the formidable Florence Nightingale. Arriving at Scutari with 38 nurses, scandalous for being working women, Nightingale found patients lying in their own excrement, instruments crusted with dried blood, and raw sewage backing up beneath the buildings. A perfect recipe for bacterial apocalypse. Her methodical reforms, improving ventilation, nutrition, and implementing revolutionary hygiene, like scrubbing and boiling things, immediately reduced mortality. Her famous Rose diagrams, using innovative statistics, showed precisely how preventable diseases decimated British forces more effectively than the enemy. Ironically, the Crimean War introduced modern elements defining future conflicts. The telegraph allowed generals to communicate or miscommunicate across vast distances, while new railways efficiently transported troops and supplies when they weren't rotting on the docks. Both sides employed lethal weaponry, like rifled muskets, offering deadly accuracy over smoothbores. The French, showing foresight, introduced the first clunky, iron-plated floating batteries, precursors to modern battleships. Most revolutionary was Roger Fenton, the world's first official war photographer. His carefully composed images, aesthetically pleasing ravines devoid of bodies and stoic officer portraits, brought visual evidence into Victorian homes, showing them the setting of the tragedy. Fenton avoided casualties due to long exposure times and the public's preference for sanitized death, but his haunting images began eroding the romantic, glorious notions of warfare. Forget Crimea's sanitized photos. A greater imperial nightmare was brewing in the east. Beneath the placid surface of Britain's most exploited possession, India, resentment and cultural clash converged, transforming a simple religious objection into the largest colonial uprising the empire ever faced. On May 10, 1857, in Meerut, 85 sepoys serving under arrogantly confident British officers were publicly imprisoned. Their crime, refusing to bite the ends off new rifle cartridges, which they correctly believed were greased with religiously polluting animal fat, cow/pig tallow. This substance was strictly forbidden to both Hindus and Muslims. Their enraged comrades violently freed the prisoners and immediately turned their weapons on their commanders. By morning, the rebels had killed dozens of Europeans, tragically including women and children, and marched toward Delhi. Unlike previous localized revolts, this rebellion spread with astonishing speed. Within weeks, mutinies erupted across northern India as sepoys abandoned posts and joined the insurrection. Rebels soon controlled the Gangetic Plain, capturing Delhi. They boldly proclaimed the elderly, slightly bewildered Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah II, the legitimate ruler of a liberated India, granting the rebellion historical legitimacy. The uprising quickly attracted widespread civilian support. Dispossessed princes, angry landlords, impoverished peasants, and religious leaders enthusiastically joined forces against the despised British rule and the East India Company's tyranny. Grievances festered for decades. EIC annexation policies deposed rulers and seized lands. Extractive revenue systems impoverished farmers. Zealous missionaries sparked fears of forced conversion, and new technologies like railways and the telegraph were viewed by traditionalists as invasive, demonic threats to cultural purity. British brutality shocked even segments of Victorian society. After the Cawnpore massacre, Nana Sahib, General Neil ordered captured rebels to perform the ultimate humiliation, licking bloodstains from the floor before immediate execution. Delhi's bloody recapture saw neighborhoods destroyed and thousands of civilians killed in revenge. Colonel Neil's hanging parties executed suspects without trial, often forcing Muslims to eat pork and Hindus beef before death, a final, calculated act of religious degradation. The British press, predictably, used an aggressive imperial lens, ensuring public opinion supported suppression. The Illustrated London News, the visual propaganda machine, published sensationalized engravings showing brave soldiers defending fainting women against savage attackers, justifying overwhelming violence. Grievances were ignored. The rebellion was dismissed as merely an irrational, unprovoked outbreak of Oriental barbarism. The EIC, the quasi-governmental entity ruling India for profit since the mid-18th century, collapsed after the 1857 catastrophe. Seizing power, Parliament passed the 1858 Government of India Act, transferring all territories to the Crown. This began the British Raj, a viceroy-led bureaucratic system designed for meticulous control and racial separation to prevent uprisings. The military underwent profound restructuring. A deliberately unbalanced army ensured British soldiers massively outnumbered Indians in critical areas like artillery and command. Recruitment focused exclusively on martial races, Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Pathans, who had been loyal. Sepoy groups were excluded, a policy designed to sow division and prevent unity. Social relations hardened into rigid, ridiculous racial hierarchies. Officials who had once adopted Indian customs now maintained strict separation, retreating into manufactured racial superiority. Colonial clubs, remote hill stations to escape the natives, and segregated neighborhoods enforced this distance. A pervasive culture of suspicion tracked troublemakers, making native newspaper surveillance routine. Queen Victoria's 1858 proclamation grandly promised religious tolerance for all Indian subjects. The cynical reality differed. The British instead pushed their civilizing mission, establishing English universities to create a new class of Indians who were, in Macaulay's precise phrase, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This unintentionally created the intellectual and political infrastructure required for Britain's eventual, and rather undignified, exit from the subcontinent. While tightening its suffocating grip on India with condescending Victorian efficiency, Britain's insatiable imperial ambitions turned towards southern Africa. There, the empire, much to its bewildered surprise, faced warriors who hadn't read the script about how primitive peoples were supposed to behave when confronted by superior European civilization and its unreliable weaponry. In 1879, High Commissioner Sir Bartle Frere, whose arrogance was matched only by his stunning lack of foresight, issued an impossible ultimatum to King Sechweo. He demanded the total disbandment of the highly effective Zulu army and the acceptance of British residency, a euphemism for total political subjugation disguised as helpful advice. When Sechweo rejected these ridiculously overreaching terms, the Anglo-Zulu War began. The British confidently assumed a swift, one-sided exercise against opponents who, according to the Imperial Handbook, were supposed to scatter upon hearing the rumble of a Maxim gun or the stern voice of an officer demanding compliance. The Zulu military system, however, was anything but primitive, possessing a discipline that rivaled European armies and outmatched the Redcoats' sloppy confidence. Built around age regiments, Amabutho, they employed sophisticated tactics, including the terrifying Buffalo Horns formation. This strategic maneuver disoriented and encircled enemies with deadly precision, turning a neat frontal engagement into a lethal ambush. Rigorously trained, Zulu soldiers fought primarily with short stabbing spears, assegai, efficient close-quarters weapons, complemented by cowhide shields and clubs. Their success proved that sophisticated strategy trumps mere reliance on expensive, mass-produced firepower. On January 22, 1879, the British suffered a catastrophic defeat at Isanlawana, a name etched into military memory not as victory, but as a spectacular, humiliating disaster involving astronomical logistical failures and profound underestimation of the enemy. Nearly 1,400 British and colonial troops, perhaps mentally composing letters home about the ease of the campaign, faced 20,000 Zulu warriors who were having none of the imperial nonsense contrary to colonial myths painting the Zulus as disorganized savages. The British were victims of their own hubris and poor tactical deployment. They were brutally outmaneuvered by disciplined regiments executing complex tactics, proving that a well-executed plan involving pointy sticks can annihilate a technologically superior force mired in administrative confusion. Over 1,300 British soldiers were killed in their worst defeat against an indigenous force, a disaster requiring an immediate, massive exercise in imperial public relations to spin it as anything other than a monumental failure of command and intelligence. The same day, just 10 miles away at Rorke's Drift Mission Station, a tiny, under-resourced outpost, another battle unfolded. Approximately 4,000 Zulu warriors, flushed with success and seeking a quick follow-up victory, attacked a garrison of just 150 British troops, mostly of the 24th Regiment, who were having the worst Tuesday of their lives. Against impossible odds, involving frantic barricade construction using mail-eye bags and biscuit tins, the British held their position through 12 hours of intense fighting, achieving a desperate defensive victory that restored some honor. The defense of Rorke's Drift became instantly legendary, serving as the necessary propaganda counterpoint to Isanlawina. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, recognizing genuine bravery while also serving as a brilliant distraction from the catastrophic tactical incompetence displayed earlier that day. The British regrouped with vast reinforcements and industrial hardware, making a fair fight impossible. By July 1879, superior firepower, the great equalizer of colonial wars, crushed Zulu resistance, proving courage and spears are no match for artillery and logistics. The final battle at Ulundi saw British squares, armed with artillery and Gatling guns, efficient machine guns spraying bullets with mechanical indifference, methodically destroy the charging Zulus, sending a message about the futility of resisting industrial power. The Zulu kingdom was ruthlessly divided into 13 territories under compliant chiefs, ending independence and paving the way for white settlement. 20 years later, having learned nothing about overconfidence, Britain stumbled into another costly war. The opponent was the Boers, Dutch settlers who were white, Christian, and possessed an unsettling familiarity with European military concepts, making them less easy to dismiss as savage hordes. The First Anglo-Boer War, 1880 to 1881, ended in an embarrassing defeat, forcing the supposedly omnipotent empire to recognize the Boer Republic's independence. But vast gold deposits in the Transvaal soon drew British interests back. Nothing motivates imperial intervention quite like the glittering allure of precious minerals. Tensions escalated as thousands of British prospectors, Uitlanders, flocked to Boer territories, demanding political rights. This created an explosive situation predicated entirely on British greed and the Boer desire to maintain control over their shiny new economy. The Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, began, much to the chagrin of the pompous British military, not with a triumphant invasion, but with Boer forces besieging key towns like Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley, demonstrating surprising tactical superiority. Early British attempts to break these sieges resulted in humiliating defeats during the infamous Black Week, December 1899, sending British military prestige into a spectacular nosedive. The uncomfortable realization dawned. Not all colonial wars were a simple matter of showing up and demanding surrender. The Boers, skilled horsemen who knew the terrain, employed hit-and-run tactics that utterly frustrated conventional British strategies, which still relied heavily on marching in neat lines, a strategy ill-suited for chasing highly mobile farmers with rifles. When the British finally gained the upper hand through the brute force application of numerical advantage, shipping hundreds of thousands of troops, the Boers shifted seamlessly to guerrilla warfare. In response to this irritating persistence, Lord Kitchener, whose reputation was built on ruthless efficiency, implemented his notorious scorched earth policy. This brutal campaign involved burning farms, destroying crops, and poisoning wells to deny commandos support, turning the countryside into a desolate wasteland. Most controversially, the British established concentration camps, interning Boer women and children alongside thousands of black Africans removed from farms, a humanitarian disaster born of military necessity and profound indifference. Conditions in these poorly managed camps were appalling, a blend of bureaucratic incompetence and deliberate neglect. Overcrowding, inadequate food, and criminally poor sanitation led to rampant outbreaks of deadly diseases, turning the camps into silent killing fields. By war's end, over 28,000 Boer civilians, mostly children under 16, had died, a devastating statistic revealing the ugly cost of imperial overreach. At least 14,000 black Africans also perished in separate, often more neglected camps, though records were poorly kept, perhaps because, in the grand scheme of imperial bookkeeping, their lives were considered less worthy of accurate tabulation. British activist Emily Hobhouse, a woman of formidable moral courage who refused to accept the official narrative of clean, antiseptic warfare, toured the camps and meticulously documented the suffering, bringing the horrifying truth back to a shocked British public, writing in a voice dripping with exasperated humanity. To keep these Boers alive at all costs was, in my opinion, the only humane and right course, a statement that seems obvious but was revolutionary in the context of official denial. Her detailed and shocking reports caused genuine outrage in Britain, where many previously complacent citizens were forced to confront and question the moral foundations of their supposedly benevolent empire, realizing that civilizing sometimes looked suspiciously like systematic extermination. Liberal politician David Lloyd George, seizing the moment of moral clarity, denounced the camps as a policy of extermination, employing language that was both inflammatory and tragically accurate, while opposition leader Henry Campbell Bannerman declared the methods not war but methods of barbarism, highlighting the hypocrisy of an empire that preached civilization while practicing mass institutionalized cruelty. As uncomfortable questions about imperial morality haunted the British conscience, forcing a brief, inconvenient moment of introspection. A parallel revolution, driven by steam and copper wire, was unfolding in workshops and laboratories across the nation, offering a convenient distraction from the messy business of colonialism. While empires rise and fall, often crumbling under the weight of their own ethical contradictions, the legacy of Victorian innovation would endure far beyond colonial borders, reshaping humanity's relationship with the physical world in ways that continue to define our lives today, proving that a good invention is often more lasting than a successful conquest. The Victorian era witnessed an unprecedented and frankly dizzying acceleration in technological development, a frantic period where inventors seemed to be competing to see who could most quickly render the previous decade's inventions obsolete. The steam engine, already transforming Britain since the late 18th century, reached new heights of efficiency and application, moving beyond mere pumping and into the realm of high-speed transport and industrial power. By 1850, over 6,000 m of railway track, ribbons of iron connecting the disparate parts of the island, crisscrossed the country, compressing time and space in ways previously unimaginable, creating a truly national, rather than regional, consciousness. Villages once isolated by days of treacherous, muddy travel became accessible in mere hours, while goods that had languished in dusty warehouses for weeks, waiting for slow canals or unreliable carts, reached markets in a single, exhilarating day. Beneath the seas, far from the smoke and noise of the great engines, a quieter, more subtle revolution was brewing, one based on the invisible magic of electricity. In 1866, after multiple frustrating and monumentally expensive failed attempts, which saw fortunes lost and reputations ruined, Cyrus Field's transatlantic telegraph cable successfully connected Europe and North America, finally making instant global communication a reality. A message that once took weeks by ship subject to the whims of the Atlantic weather and the speed of sail, now traveled in mere minutes, reducing the vast ocean to a mere electrical whisper. Queen Victoria exchanged suitably formal and congratulatory telegrams with President Andrew Johnson, thereby validating the immense cost, while stock prices synchronized almost instantly between London and New York exchanges, creating the first truly globalized financial market and giving nervous brokers ulcers in two continents simultaneously. When the Franco-Prussian War erupted in 1870, the British public, enjoying their new immediacy, read about battles and troop movements the very same day they occurred, a level of media immediacy we take utterly for granted today, but which, at the time, felt like something pulled directly from a science fiction novel. The Victorian cityscape transformed visibly and dramatically through technological innovation, shedding its medieval shadow with startling speed. Gas lighting, introduced early in the century, cast a warm, if slightly hissing and smelly, glow onto the streets, illuminating previously dark alleys and extending productive hours far beyond the setting of the sun. By the 1880s, electric lighting, brighter, cleaner, and far more modern, began its steady, conquering march through urban Britain, signaling the inevitable obsolescence of the gas lamps. The first electric street lighting appeared in Newcastle in 1879, while London's financial district, predictably recognizing the importance of being able to count money efficiently after dark, became officially electrified in 1882. The wealthy soon demanded private electrical installations, viewing the humming wires and glowing bulbs as the ultimate status symbol, proof that they were living firmly in the future. By 1890, nearly 400 private generating plants, often loud and slightly dangerous contraptions, operated in London homes and businesses, powering the lives of the elite in manufacturing. The humble yet incredibly powerful sewing machine revolutionized clothing production, transforming the labor-intensive industry and forever changing the lives of mill workers and housewives alike. Isaac Singer's 1851 improvements, which focused on user-friendliness and reliable mechanics, made machine sewing accessible far beyond the confines of the massive, impersonal factories. By the 1860s, the home sewing machine became a middle-class fixture, granting women a new degree of domestic efficiency, while factories utilizing industrial versions turned out affordable ready-made garments, signaling the beginning of modern consumer fashion. Meanwhile, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, a device that promised to eliminate the need for writing letters and dramatically increase the amount of unnecessary chatter, demonstrated awkwardly at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, would transform business communication within mere decades, forcing executives to learn the difficult art of conducting transactions without ever seeing the recipient's facial expression. Domestic life experienced its own quiet technological renaissance, often overlooked in favor of the spectacular public inventions, but equally profound in its impact on daily existence. Thomas Crapper, contrary to persistent popular belief perpetuated by amusing urban myths, didn't actually invent the flush toilet, but his significant improvements in trap design and, crucially, his aggressive and skillful marketing helped to popularize indoor plumbing, making the bathroom a room of comparative hygiene and civilized function. Alicia Otis Safety Elevator, a device that fundamentally changed the definition of a building's practical height, demonstrated dramatically at New York's Crystal Palace in 1854, when he famously cut the hoisting rope while riding his platform. A marketing stunt of breathtaking bravery, transformed urban architecture and made high-rise living possible, allowing people to live far above the muddy, smelly streets. Even laundry day, that ancient and back-breaking domestic chore, saw innovation with the first mechanical washing machines, loud, churning contraptions that promised to save labor, appearing in wealthier homes by the 1890s, slowly dragging the washroom into the industrial age. The era's inventors achieved celebrity status unprecedented for men of science, moving from obscure workshop tinkers to household names whose every pronouncement was headline news. When Isambard Kingdom Brunel's massive steamship Great Eastern, a vessel so huge it was practically an island, finally launched in 1858, Over 30,000 spectators gathered along the Thames just to witness the sheer spectacle of this engineering marvel. His railways, his soaring bridges, and his colossal ships made him a household name, a titan of iron and steam. Similarly, when Thomas Edison demonstrated his phonograph, the magical talking machine, at London's Crystal Palace in 1888, crowds waited hours for a glimpse of the Wizard of Menlo Park and his marvelous talking machine, queuing patiently to hear a disembodied voice reproduced by a diaphragm in a wax cylinder. Not all Victorian innovations were spectacular, headline-grabbing affairs involving massive ships or transatlantic cables. Many were small, subtle changes that profoundly affected everyday life. The humble tin can, perfected in the 1860s with the subsequent invention of the can opener, which, hilariously, only became necessary after the can itself was widespread, revolutionized food preservation and distribution, allowing armies to be fed and global trade routes to be extended further than ever before. Rubber tires, initially developed and perfected for bicycles before automobiles, were anything more than a noisy, unreliable novelty, made transportation smoother and noticeably quieter, reducing the bone-jarring rattle of urban travel. The safety bicycle, with its chain drive and two equal-sized wheels, a design infinitely more practical and less terrifying than the high-wheeled penny farthing, introduced in the 1880s, gave women unprecedented mobility and contributed directly to clothing reform movements, as corsets and cumbersome skirts proved utterly incompatible with rapid cycling. These innovations, both grand and small, fed directly into imperial ambition, providing the essential sinews of control and rapid response that made governing a quarter of the globe even remotely feasible. Railways built in India, often against fierce resistance and always for strategic purposes, reduced troop movement times from weeks of arduous marching to mere days, ensuring that rebellions could be swiftly and brutally suppressed. Telegraph lines connecting far-flung colonial outposts allowed governors to receive instructions from London, however ill-informed, without delay, ensuring centralized control and preventing local commanders from exercising too much dangerous independent judgment. British technology became a highly visible calling card of empire, presented as irrefutable evidence of European superiority and, therefore, a moral justification for rule over those who had not yet mastered the steam engine. When electric lighting, the ultimate symbol of modernity, was installed in Kolkata in 1879, the Viceroy, naturally, declared it proof of Britain's undeniable civilizing mission, neatly ignoring the fact that the vast majority of the colonized population would remain in darkness for decades to come. The dawn of 1901 brought a profound and ultimately melancholic moment in British history, signaling not just the end of a long reign, but the definitive closure of an era defined by a very particular kind of stern, moralizing certainty. On January 22nd, Queen Victoria drew her final breath at Osborne House, ending a rule that had spanned 63 years and witnessed the zenith of British power. Her death marked the end of an era that had fundamentally reshaped Britain and, through the sheer reach of the empire, much of the world, leaving behind a legacy both glorious and deeply troubling. As the Queen's body made its final, somber journey to Windsor, the nation stood still, caught awkwardly between a deep, perhaps slightly exaggerated, reverence for the recently departed past and a palpable uncertainty about the dizzying, technologically advanced future. Victoria's son, Edward VII, ascended the throne at the ripe age of 59, already embodying a very different, much less puritanical sensibility than his recently deceased mother. Where Victoria had been famously known for her conservative values, her deep commitment to black mourning clothes, and her severely moralizing demeanor, Edward brought a distinctly un-Victorian love of pleasure, a commitment to leisure, and a cosmopolitan, continental taste that favored bright colors and fast living. The transformation at the very top of society, from stern duty to relaxed hedonism, reflected broader changes already underway throughout the empire, where the rigid rules of the previous age were rapidly fraying. The certainties that had defined Victorian Britain, the unquestioning belief in eternal progress and imperial destiny, were visibly dissolving under the pressure of global events. The empire that had stretched across nearly a quarter of the globe was showing undeniable signs of strain, like an overstretched rubber band about to snap. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, had proved unexpectedly difficult and profoundly controversial, requiring hundreds of thousands of troops and vast expenditure just to defeat what was supposed to be a minor colonial opponent. A clear indicator that the old days of cheap, easy conquest were over in India. Nationalism was stirring among educated elites who had been schooled in British universities, absorbing the very principles of liberty and self-determination only to find themselves denied equal opportunities and treated as second-class citizens in their own country. A classic, self-defeating imperial paradox. Meanwhile, international competitors were aggressively emerging, refusing to play by Britain's old rules. Germany's rapid industrialization and ambitious, rapidly growing navy posed a direct, existential challenge to British naval supremacy, forcing London to embark on a ruinous and expensive arms race. While the United States, that upstart former colony, was quietly transforming itself into an unstoppable economic powerhouse, overshadowing Britain's industrial output. The old, comforting assumption that Britain would forever lead the world no longer seemed guaranteed, replaced by a nagging sense of decline. Domestically, social hierarchies that had seemed immutable were being challenged from multiple, often militant directions. The Labour Party was formally founded in 1900, giving working-class movements a formal political voice for the first time, threatening the comfortable dominance of the old liberal and conservative aristocracies. The Women's Social and Political Union, formed in 1903 by the formidable Emmeline Pankhurst, brought new, increasingly militant tactics to the fight for women's suffrage, demanding radical change rather than politely petitioning for it. Even the aristocracy, the very pinnacle of the social pyramid, faced unprecedented pressures as agricultural depression and newly introduced inheritance taxes threatened their economic foundations, forcing the sale of ancestral lands. The artistic world, ever the barometer of cultural anxiety, captured this atmosphere of profound transition and nervous uncertainty with remarkable acuity. The late Victorian writings of Thomas Hardy portrayed a rural England rapidly disappearing under the relentless forces of industrial modernization, lamenting the loss of pastoral simplicity. Oscar Wilde's brilliant, glittering wit masked a deeper, more trenchant critique of entrenched social hypocrisy, revealing the moral rot beneath the velvet draperies of polite society. Joseph Conrad's chilling masterpiece, Heart of Darkness, 1899, dared to question the moral legitimacy of the entire imperial project itself, exposing the darkness at the core of the civilizing mission. These darker, more psychological explorations hinted at the powerful modernist movement that would flourish violently in the years ahead, shattering artistic conventions along with social ones. Technology simultaneously accelerated the sense of entering a new, bewildering age. By 1901, electric street lights illuminated major cities, transforming nightlife. The first cinemas were appearing in urban centers, offering a revolutionary, instantly accessible form of mass entertainment, moving pictures that captivated the working classes. Marconi had successfully transmitted complex radio signals across the Atlantic, hinting at a future of wireless communication that would shrink the globe even further. The Wright brothers' first, momentous flight was just 2 years away, promising to conquer the last great frontier of movement, the sky. The automobile, though still an expensive and often unreliable luxury, promised to reshape both urban design and personal mobility. The short Edwardian era that followed Victoria's death, lasting from 1901 to 1910, is often portrayed in hazy retrospect as a sunlit afternoon of garden parties, elegant country houses, and ceaseless champagne consumption, a final golden age of leisure. While there was indeed a noticeable reaction against Victorian restraint among the upper classes, embracing decadence and enjoyment, beneath the surface lay growing, intractable social tensions that refused to be ignored. The constitutional crisis of 1909 to 1911 dramatically reduced the legislative power of the House of Lords, signaling a shift towards democracy and away from entrenched aristocratic privilege. Labor strikes became increasingly common and militant, often leading to violent confrontations. The suffragette movement grew more confrontational, forcing the issue of women's rights onto the national agenda through acts of calculated disruption. What nobody, in their elegant drawing rooms or their bustling laboratories, could possibly foresee was how completely and violently the First World War, an event of unimaginable scale, would sweep away the comfortable, class-ridden world the Victorians had so painstakingly built. The catastrophic conflict that erupted in 1914 destroyed four major empires, killed millions of young men across Europe, and shattered the entire 19th century's naive faith in inevitable progress and the goodness of technology. Yet even as Victorian certainties faded and were replaced by the trauma of the trenches, Victorian infrastructure remained, visible in the enduring railway networks and the deep, reliable sewer systems, in the established school systems and the meticulous civil service. Procedures in the remnants of colonial administrations and the sturdy legal codes that governed much of the world. The Victorian era, with its blend of breathtaking innovation and profound moral failure, shaped the world we live in, leaving behind systems and ideas that we still grapple with today. From public health initiatives to the establishment of mass education to the ongoing fight for economic fairness, it reminds us that real change, the kind that fundamentally alters society, comes not from imperial decree, but when ordinary people demand it loudly and persistently. If you found this journey through technological marvels and moral muddles fascinating, perhaps hit subscribe, because there's always more history, often funny, always ironic, just beneath the surface of the present day.